Fans know the story. In ancient times, world-shifting magics existed in the hands of the great and powerful, shaped by the universe into games of chance, until sealed away by a king who lost his identity. But this is the tale of how those shadow games returned to the world.
Ask you say what you want. Ask you say what you want. Ask you say what you want. The fire.
To start with Yu-Gi-Oh! From the beginning is ultimately a hydra of conflicting content. Do you start from the manga? Do you go with the first series that got imported, or do you possibly sit through what is known as Toei Season 0? While there's conflicts with all three, the main anime diverges from the mangas and, well, it's mostly considered all the better for it, but by doing so you missed arcs that inform the main cast. And then you might think, hey, maybe what syncs with the anime is in the season that wasn't imported. Well, no. That's the issue you run into with Toei Season 0. While it uses the pre-duelist arcs of the manga as its basis, it pretty much rewrites the chapters and stretches them out or compresses them haphazardly and to repetitive effect. Though ironically, if it weren't for the fact that death, cruelty, and a lot of adult jokes and content are present, the Toei adaptation is right up 4Kids' alley. Granted, it's majorly watered down for the manga, but what ended up resulting here and be consistent with the later entries, some would see as a fate worse than death, and certainly end up being naught but nightmare fuel, which was kind of the point in the first place. The starting ground for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise is the tale of Yugimoto, a lonely short-statured high school student who comes into possession of the Millennium Puzzle, an Egyptian artifact his grandfather uncovered in his time as an archaeologist. He endeavors to solve the puzzle, if only for the hopes it will grant him his deepest wish. And, due to actions involving his classmates, he does end up doing so, though not without difficulties. Chiefly, that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Universe is populated by fucking assholes. Yes, Toshiki Inoue did work on this anime. And said assholes are quick to abuse and take advantage of those they view beneath them. And when you're a 15-year-old boy with the stature of a kid half your age, you're going to get your ass kicked hard and your ass kicked often. Especially in a country where homogeny isn't so much enforced, but expected. But after completing the puzzle, this is where Yugi is given his wish, and gains a guardian spirit, that of the Egyptian pharaoh who sealed his soul into the artifact. And this spirit is a twisted motherfucker. And honestly, on the Toshiki Inoue thing, it's probably the mildest we see of something expected of his tropes when he does original things here, as thanks to the depiction in the manga, he ultimately needs to somewhat follow it. Meaning, pretty much everyone that's horrible to others needs to have quick retribution occur, as the series doesn't have room for ongoing minor antagonists. And that's where Tem... And yes, I'll be referring to the Nameless Pharaoh by his actual name. The series is 20 years old. I think the window for spoilers has expired. Anyways, that's where Tem comes in, challenging these bastards, bullies, and neophytes to games of chance. And that's where the repetitiveness of the series comes in, and how the plots all play out. Yugi and company go through an everyday event that is in some way exaggerated, often invoking games or other collectibles. They encounter an asshole who believes it's their right to dominate and oppress or otherwise do what the hell they want, and eventually they manage to take off the spirit of the pharaoh, who sits at the shadow game, most of which take the form of challenges with pretty clear rules to invoke fairness. The problem is, the games are all rigged in the spirit's favor, as he has thought ahead farther than his opponents, to almost ridiculously easy defeat most of the time, and you can't help but want that with how they are depicted as absolutely horrible human beings. Actually, I take that back. It's almost Inoue's specialty to craft characters that are scum of humanity, so, in a way, he helps sell the day-to-day antagonists quite effectively. Help that he can't do his normal thing with making them stick around, as the assholes are meant to lose the game. But loss doesn't actually do anything to them most of the time. That is, if they even reach the point of them losing. Because the game is meant as a judge of character. You are screwed either way. You will lose either way. So, do you accept the loss, or try to cheat your fate? And many of the games are set up in such a way so as to invoke more instinctive emotions and survival instincts, keeping them from thinking through their choices, so the purest, rawest form of their character can be illuminated, or take advantage of the opposing player's following of the rules to their own advantage. And thus, most of them cheat, and thus invoke the penalty game, the Shadow Game's punishment for those who would violate the challenge presented to them. This would come in the form of the aforementioned nightmare fuel, where you're tortured with horrific hallucinations and delusions of your own desires and insecurities, effectively destroying the sinner without actually killing them. That or the original manga would have the penalty game's trauma be so severe that people end up killing themselves by accident. This series started out as really frickin' dark. There are of course a few exceptions. In the 5th episode, Shoddy just straight up murders a dude that fails his shadow game, but it's less frequent. Principal characters, on top of Yugi, introduced this series are the nameless pharaoh spirit of the Millennium Puzzle, Atem. Atem doesn't have much of an arc this series, mainly because at the time this was made, his identity was far more obscure, at times seeming as just a split persona from Yugi that was born of the Millennium Puzzle's magic, not even Shoddy knowing quite what he was in this iteration. And despite being a sadist and confident in himself, he seemed to work more off of Yugi's memories than anything, or in fact was the inspiration for Yugi to act, though that's contrasted by how when Atem would take over, Yugi would black out and lose the spans of time he was in control. Jinochi Katsuya, who as opposed to his standard counterpart is more rougher around the edges and more direct, initially wanting to try and toughen Yugi up so he wouldn't be picked on by less scrupulous people, but overall coming off as a harsh, reserved, and somewhat perverted teenager, mainly as that was what life had taught him he needed to survive. Jinochi has a sister, who he rarely sees due to his parents separating, him going with his father, and the implication from this series is the split was not resulting in the happiest of familial relations. But the need to be strong at all times lessens as he too interacts with the others, most showcased when a gang he was previously part of tries to force him back into their ranks, and his eventual refusal to be part of that again because he's found something better. Anzu Masaki, the wannabe dancer and straight man, to much of the others' antics. Anzu for the most part is the normal one, confident in herself, and the possibility of achieving her dream of dancing her life away in New York, and has made plans of how to get herself there. Unfortunately, with her having the longest standing relation with Yugi, and the fact she's a girl, she often ends up becoming a victim, which is used to cause Yugi to call out to Atem. As most of their antagonists have weapons or other means of inflicting death, it's understandable she'd not want to antagonize them, but it still gets irksome with its repetition. Honda Hiroto, who is consistently characterized, as opposed to being Jonichi's collaborator, as the straight-laced type over-obsessed with order, to the point he joined the school's janitor club. Japanese schools have most of the custodial duty taken over by the students set in a rotation, but Honda tends to get defensive of this decision, referring to himself and his task as beautification, and is using it as a stepping stone to become the class president. Aim high, dude. As such, this is where most of the series' running gags go to die. And lastly is Miho, a character from one chapter of the manga who serves as fifth man to the band, and is characterized as a total ditz, in opposition to the shy librarian-esque iteration from the manga. Honda has a massive and repeatedly lampshaded crush on her. She also consistently refers to herself in the third person, and is for the most part completely useless. You know, people complain about how useless Honda is in Duelist, but he at least actually did something at some point in the manga, and is a carried over character for that, and did things off screen periodically. You could cut Miho from nearly every episode, as she does almost nothing and was not part of events originally to even matter. Most of the antagonists aren't of much note, be they schoolyard bullies, teachers obsessed with their pride and oppression due to their own character failings, thieves and criminals, or a terrorist that has people trapped by his explosives in a Ferris wheel. And did I mention this show could get freaking dark? But there are only 4 of note, as they are characters that carry on. First is the villain of the first episode, Tetsuo Ushio, a hall monitor with delusions of grandeur in opposing a greater order on the school than already exists, kicking Honda and Jonochi's asses for Yugi for misunderstanding an encounter as bullying, only for it to be caused as a protection racket, and his greed to be his ultimate undoing. But despite being Atem's first victim in the series, Tetsuo would become a recurring character, seen and mentioned not just in Duelist, but also in GX, before graduating to regular cast member in 5Ds. Yes, Officer Ushio is that same jackass that kicked the King of Games' ass, and it just makes Yusei trouncing him kind of cathartic, but also ends up showing a redemption for the man due to the way he righted himself after the penalty game inflicted upon him, which shows that good things can come from what is intended as a traumatizing experience. Shadi, holder of the Millennium Scale and Key. While he initially comes to Japan following tomb robbers, he becomes intrigued by Yugi having solved the Millennium Puzzle and seeks to test him by threatening his friends.
That's a dick move.
I apologize if I have offended.
Dick move.
Shadi after this would become an ally in learning more of the intricacies of the Millennium items and their connections to Egypt, though certainly while still remaining a dick. Seto and Mokuba Kaiba, and unfortunately, this is where we get a fair amount of canon discontinuity. The Seto in this series is a cruel, sadistic monster, going to much more elaborate lengths to first try and claim the Blue Eyes White Dragon card, and then attempt to get revenge on Yugi when he's forced into a draw in a shadow game. He's far more petty a man, and far less sympathetic, and his revenge serves as the only story arc in the show with him and his various game masters that challenge Yugi and force his friends into death traps. In fact, for the most part, this version of the character would be discarded and later recycled into the filler arc antagonist Noah Kaiba, as even Kazuki Takahashi realized that with how he was depicted later, there was a long-running inconsistency and motivational disconnect in his actions that can't fully be accounted for as a penance brought by the penalty game inflicted upon him. Thus, the following anime's depiction not only corrected all of that by ignoring everything here, but actually manages to depict him as a truly sympathetic character, which I will explain when I get to the Duelist Kingdom arc, as it's admittedly subtle. And since Takahashi was heavily involved in the anime for Duelist, that was likely intentional. Though we see a few glimpses of Seto's true character appear, especially with the last of the challengers he sends against Yugi, who taught him the games he too cherishes, which helps show this Seto as more of a dark reflection of Yugi, someone who loves games, but not for the enjoyment of them and the interaction they provide, but as another means of showing your dominance over them. There's no depiction of this attitude as having been forced upon him by the upbringing of his bastard stepfather, or the forced upon him motivation to win at all costs to get what he needs, or a context to the reason why he has a bond with the Blue Eyes. It's just a rare card here. It's not symbolic of a greater dream. Hell, we see him as just as cruel to his stepfather undeservedly in the context of this adaptation of the work. And while it's more satisfying when he ultimately goes down, it doesn't really make it easy to swallow him as Yugioh's answer to Piccolo or Vegeta. Especially with how callous he is to Mokuba, who would later be revealed that his little brother would be one of the pillars his life would be built around. Here, seeing him as just as useless to him, just as much a failure as all his subordinates, despite being family. Lastly is Ryo Bakura and the Spirit of the Millennium Ring, whose only showcase as the series concludes with the beginning of his specialty in RPGs, and makes games far more sinister as he one by one sucks all of them into the one he crafts for the group, before being defeated, for now. I'll give the Toei anime this: it sells the ring's spirit, who I'll refer to as Bakura, as far more cunning than he's often given credit for. It's not just tenacity that resulted in him coming back, but forethought and planning. This felt nothing more than the opening shot of a long game, no pun intended, and simply testing the mettle of his enemy before everything would be in place for his later plans. He's certainly a better example of the dark reflection, as Bakura absolutely, 100% possesses and dominates Ryo in their possessor and possessee relationship, whereas Atem is content to stay out of things until needed or called upon in some way by Yugi's situations. It better showcases how Ryo is a victim to the spirit's machinations, and Bakura's encroaching threats all the more believable. Something that irritated me about this anime to no end is the obvious lack of any production value. It is exceedingly basic and bare-bones animation, even for the time. No joking, I've seen hentai from this era with a higher animation budget than Toei put into this anime. I guess it's because financially in the mid to late 90s, Toei was not having a good time. But if this was all the effort they were capable of then it's no wonder that Kazuki Takahashi and Shonen Jump would then take the series to Studio Gallop, where the franchise remains to this day, and simply rehash the important and backstory plots that this anime depicts with a better context and consistency to them, ones that are understandable for the characters. In other words, Toei Season 0 is the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise's equivalent to Dot Hack Roots. It's a prequel story to a story's main event, and is all considered to have happened, but not as depicted, as that depiction is not reflective of how the characters would later be represented or develop, and ultimately conflict with the story and appreciation of it. It is an entry that, despite informing backstory and beginning characterization, you otherwise have to disregard. Which is a bit unfortunate, as despite my statements that unlike Roots, it's not actually bad or wastes people's time, as you see the beginnings of the greatness the show would feature, and it really is at this time about appreciating games, entertainment, and fun with friends, just with magic and douchebags shoved in to complicate things. And the games are quite creative, if albeit lacking in fleshing out their rules and intricacies, but most of them were based on real games Kazuki Takahashi played. Hell, Magic and Wizards, which would later become Duel Monsters, was heavily inspired by Magic the Gathering, which Kazuki Takahashi is a huge fan of. And now, Yu-Gi-Oh!, the card game, is Magic's longest existing competitive... Wait, no, the Pokemon card game trumps them on that. Why is that game still around? But yeah, other games first featured here, such as Capsule Monsters, would be seen in later incarnations and more developed as well. Overall, though, the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Series does set the stage for what would come after, and is consistent with the franchise's narrative themes, which ultimately I can summarize as...
Violence is not strength and compassion is not weakness!
Because friendship is shadow magic! Wait.